comes up, and take a look at the face of this man. If you know who it is, don't tell anybody because that's going to spoil my sermon illustration, so keep it to yourself. You can feel superior to people again. But just look at this man and make some quick judgmental conclusions on what you think he's like. Is he happy? Is he angry? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he nice or mean? And as you're thinking and making these judgments, I'll give you one piece of information. This man was executed for his role in a plot to assassinate a world leader. How does that color your impression? Does he seem really mean now? Because generally murdering people isn't considered very nice. Especially murdering world leaders tends to be frowned upon. If you have that bit of information, maybe you imagine this man is definitely not somebody you'd want to spend time with, that he's definitely not a role model, that he's definitely not somebody to look up to. But what if I were to add the piece of information that this man's name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that he was a leader in the church during the time of Nazi Germany, that the world leader who he was implicated in the plot to assassinate was Adolf Hitler, who was in the process of exterminating the Jewish people. Suddenly your impression of this man would change a little bit, wouldn't it? We know a little bit from what he looks like, but if we just take his looks and his actions, it's easy to make a snap judgment. When we learn a little bit more of the backstory, suddenly our impression of this man changes quite a lot. We've all had this happen to us, haven't we? Somebody makes a judgment based off of only our actions, even if our intentions are really good, and they assume sometimes the worst. Maybe you've sent a thoughtful text or kind email that someone somehow interpreted was sarcastic, and they took offense at what was supposed to be a really nice comment. Maybe you threw somebody a party, but they thought it was a pity party, and they took personal offense to that. We've all been there where somebody has judged our actions or judged our appearances, and they haven't taken the time to consider our good intentions. Sometimes we've been on the other side, where we've looked at the way somebody's acted, the things they've done, the way they've behaved, the things they've not done, and we assume we know what that type of person is like. Then we actually have a conversation with them and we realize, oh man, they were nothing like I thought they were. Sometimes it's easy to think as Christians we should keep our spiritual walks, our relationships with God to ourselves, because people are prone to make such quick judgments. I don't want to let anybody in on my struggles because they might make a judgment on me. I don't want to ask how they're doing in their life because they might not think that I'm the type of person they'd want to know about their life. But today we're going to look at a story in Joshua 22 at what happens when two groups of very different people with very quick judgments actually take the moment to hear what the other has to say. And we're going to conclude that it's not just a helpful lesson on how to be a better communicator, 3 quick steps to not be misunderstood, but instead this passage actually illumines us to what it looks like to walk in community with one another, how listening to one another and how 2 different sides can actually strengthen our relationship with God if we don't quickly judge good intentions. I'll give a little bit of background before we dive into Joshua 22, just so you have an idea of the foundation of this story. At the beginning of the chapter, we're told that Joshua summoned 3 tribes, 3 groups of the people of Israel. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and half a tribe of Manasseh. And what's special about these tribes is they were on the eastern side of the Jordan River. You might not be able to see the small writing, but you can see the body of water at the bottom and the top. That's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, separated by the Jordan River. And these 3 tribes on the eastern side of the Jordan, they already had their land, but the men of the tribes came over to the western side to help their brother Israel with the conquest. So now at the end of Joshua, when the land has been taken, the mission has been completed, there are no more enemies to fight, Joshua tells these tribes, You can go on back to your homes. God's given us rest as He's promised. You can go back to your homes on the side of the Jordan. Just make sure that you obey our God. Keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of God, gave to you. That seems like things are going well. God's promises have been fulfilled. All they've got to do is obey them. But then, they go back and they do something terrible. They build a large altar of imposing size. Which, what's so bad about building an altar of imposing size? I'm not so sure, but the rest of Israel's pretty offended. Because when they hear of it, they gather their whole army at Shiloh to go to war against them. What's so bad about building an altar? Why is Israel about to go to war over it? And what in the world does this story have to do with us? That's what we'll encounter as we go through Joshua chapter 22 this morning. I'll be reading from verses 15 through 31. When they went to Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they said to them, "The whole assembly of the Lord says, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against Him now? Was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell on the community of the Lord. And are you now turning away from the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow He'll be angry with the whole community of Israel. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves, other than the altar of the Lord our God." When Achan the son of Zerah acted unfaithfully regarding the devoted things, did not wrath come upon the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one who died for his sin. Then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh responded to the heads of the clans of Israel. "The mighty one, the God, the Lord. The mighty one, the God, the Lord. He knows, and let Israel know. If this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord, and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings, or to offer fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord Himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear, that someday your descendants might say to ours, 'What do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made a Jordan a boundary between us and you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord.' So your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That's why we said, 'Let us get ready and build an altar.' But not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it's to be a witness between us and you, and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at His sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and fellowship offerings. Then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to ours, 'You have no share in the Lord.' And we said, if they ever do say to us or our descendants, we will answer, 'Look at this replica of the Lord's altar, which our fathers built, not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord and turn away from Him today, by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sacrifices, other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before His tabernacle." When Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the community, the heads of the clans of the Israelites, heard what Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had to say, they were pleased. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, said to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, "Today we know the Lord is with us, because you have not acted unfaithfully towards the Lord in this matter. Now you have rescued the Israelites from the Lord's hand." That's a pretty clear story, right? We can all go home and take our very clear applications to our personal lives on why to not build altars and how to not have civil wars. That's pretty straightforward. We probably don't need a rest of a sermon today. But we probably should have one, because there's a few questions here that eluded me, that might elude all of us. When we open it up, we're left wondering a few things. Firstly, what's the big deal? What's the big deal about building an altar? It's just a pile of rocks. Why does Israel almost start a civil war over it? Secondly, why is it not a big deal anymore? What is it about Israel or the eastern tribes' explanation that calms down the western tribes? Why are they now friends again after nearly going to war? And then finally, what in the world does it have to do with us? Because this doesn't mirror many of our daily interactions with our friends. Or does it? Could it? Because what we'll see from this story today is that when God's people take him seriously and when they obey him purposefully, they actually experience his presence. When God's people take him seriously, when they follow his commands, and when they obey him purposefully, not just keep the commands, but consider who they're obeying, they experience his presence. They get to know him more deeply. And these two sets of tribes are able to encounter God through the strengths one another brought to the table. And maybe we might experience the same ourselves if we're willing to let others walk alongside us in our own Christian lives. Let's take a look at these ideas, starting with what it looks like to take God seriously, because that's the strength of the Western tribes. When they show up to confront the Eastern tribes, they're clearly taking God's commands seriously. How could you turn away from God like this? How could you build yourselves an altar? They're taking God's commands really seriously. They're confronting their friends when they're not taking God's commands seriously. Those are both really good things. We should obey God's commands. When we see others of our Christian friends not walking with God, we should challenge and confront them on it. Maybe not with a 100,000 person army, but at least confront and challenge and ask. Those are good principles. But why was this command so serious? What was so bad about building an altar? Well, if we look back at the law God gave his people, starting in the book of Exodus, we see the very first command God gave to Israel after the 10 Commandments was this one. Do not make any gods besides me, but build me an altar where you'll make sacrifices and offerings on it. See, altars and sacrifices were really common in the ancient Near Eastern time. It was as normal a form of worship as we might say singing or praying or giving of money is today. It transcends several different religions, several different denominations. You might see many different people groups that worship with singing or prayer or giving of offerings. And in the same way, back in the ancient Near East, sacrificing an animal on a stone altar was a very common form of worship. But God wanted to make clear to Israel it was a form of worship not just to any random god, but specifically to him. The danger that would happen would be Israel would do this form of worship and blend it with other gods. That's what we see them cite in Joshua 22:17. When they reference the sin of Peor, they're quoting a story back in the book of Numbers where they were sacrificing offerings on altars. But it was to a false god named Baal on altars that were not for their God. The religions became blended because the forms of worship were similar. We see this happen all the time today still. You see people who begin to blend versions of Christianity with maybe some other religions. And you hear people say frequently, well, all religions are really the same, they worship the same, they do the same, doesn't any religion get you to heaven? Which is a nice sentiment, but if we believe in the Bible, it's not true. If we believe in the Bible that tells us Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven, then it's not the form of worship that gets us there. Now, if we look at the form of worship, the concern God has isn't just with what it looks like. The concern is who they're worshiping. God gave them very clear instructions in the rest of the law. In the book of Deuteronomy, be careful not to sacrifice your offerings just anywhere you please. Instead, sacrifice them only at the place the Lord will choose. Oh, that's a helpful instruction. What's the place God chooses? Well, we're told in the book of Leviticus. Are you enjoying our magical bus tour through the first 5 books? It's exciting, isn't it? Leviticus tells us that any Israelite who offers a sacrifice must not do it outside the tent of meeting, also known as the tabernacle. Well, that's not too helpful. What's a tabernacle? Can I get that on sale at Home Depot next to the altars? The tabernacle was the tent that God essentially lived in during Israel's time in the desert. It was the precursor to the temple. It was a place where God met with the priests, where he met with Moses, and where the people came to pray and to offer sacrifices to God. It was a place where God was uniquely present. You could not go to the tabernacle and not realize God, the God of Israel, was there. God specifically gave instructions so that when the people worship, they wouldn't just be doing worship. They would be specifically worshiping him. That's why it would be so serious if you built another altar. Because if you're building another altar, chances are you're starting to worship another god. Chances are you're going to forget about the tabernacle. Chances are you're not so concerned about who you're worshiping, but just worshiping. That's why the command is so serious. And to the credit of the eastern tribes, they take it really seriously too. They say, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows. Let Israel know. If this has been in rebellion against God, then do not spare us today. If it's been building our own altar to turn away from God, to offer our own sacrifices, then let's have God himself call us to account. They take it seriously. They respond to the other tribe's challenge. And that's really good. And we'll get to the explanation in a second. But before we do, it's important we pause here for a moment. Because you and I are often in danger of doing this very thing. You might say, what are you talking about, Pastor Steve? I haven't sacrificed an animal on a stone altar for at least 6 months. Like, I'm over that. But we might not have literal stone altars we sacrifice animals on. But we certainly do have altars that we place our own gods on. Every human is prone to worship something. All of us are prone to have something that's most important to us that we ascribe worth to, that we give our affection to, that we give our energy to, that we give our time to. And all of us are prone, like Israel, to make that anything besides God. An altar is anything that we choose to worship, that we choose to make more important than God himself. That we would say to God, don't take this away from me. I'll live for you. I'll do what you want, but don't you dare take away this altar. Maybe it's an altar of entertainment and enjoyment and comfort. Maybe it's an altar of alcohol, of addiction. Maybe it's an altar of other people's impressions, of wanting to be liked. We all have a tendency to build some altar to our own God that we place ahead of the God of Israel and say, yeah, God, I'll worship you, but don't take this one away from me. What might that altar be in your life? And like the people of Israel, are you willing to have others come alongside you and challenge you and help you to tear down that altar? Because if God himself has commanded who we are to worship, that's the command we better take really seriously. That's the first idea we see present, but the eastern tribes have a really interesting combination to that idea. They say, yeah, we're taking it seriously, but there's another component here. We didn't do it for that reason, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what have you to do with the Lord? So yeah, hold on, we are taking it seriously. We didn't build this altar for sacrifice. Hear us out. Imagine our kids in the future. Can you imagine them bullying ours on the playground because you have the tabernacle on your side and we don't? Can you imagine them saying, the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you, you Reubenites and Gadites. Reubenites and Gadites. You can imagine them mocking them. You can imagine them saying, we have the tabernacle. What do you guys have? That's why they said, we built this. We're worried your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. We built it, we said, let's not build it for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but so it will be a witness that all of us actually are going to sacrifice and worship the Lord in the place He's chosen. It's not what you think it is. It's not this terrible, negative, false God you're afraid of. It's not something saying we're going away from God. It's actually showing we're going to follow God. Think of it this way. Imagine back when the United States purchased Alaska in the early mid-20th century. Alaska is not an entity. The Alaskans said to themselves, oh man, it's great to be a part of the United States, but we have this small country called Canada that's a boundary between us and them. And what if our kids don't really feel like a part of the United States? What if other United States people come to visit us and they don't think we're really a part of them? We know what we'll do. Let's build a copy of the White House. We'll build our own White House so that when our kids see it and they ask us about it, we can say, that's a replica of the White House back in America, which we're a part of. That's not our own White House, but it shows that we're under the government of that White House. But you can also imagine other Americans coming to Alaska, seeing the White House and saying, oh, those Alaskans? Who do they think they are? They're building their own White House? Oh, we'll show them. We'll take that down. But when they show up with their torches and with their weapons, the Alaskans say, well, hold on. Look inside. It's empty. There's nobody here. There's no president. There's no government. It's just a replica. It's not a symbol that we're rebelling against you. It's a symbol that we're a part of you. It's the exact opposite of what you thought it was. That's what the Eastern tribes are trying to say. If your descendants say these things to us, we can say, look, it's the replica of the Lord's altar. This shows that we're under that altar. We're under that tabernacle. We're under that God. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord by building an altar besides the one at his tabernacle. Now that's all happy and great and wonderful and explains the story, but it feels a little far away from us. Because once again, these types of civil wars over altars just aren't in our day-to-day. What is the point? What's the idea? What significance does it have for us? Well, when I was really young, like kindergarten and first grade, you know those assignments that teachers would give you with like the paper that had a picture and all these lines with numbers, and you had to color different colors within the lines? Teacher, Mrs. Chris, is nodding in the back. Yeah, something like that. The point being, I was the best person at coloring in the lines that ever lived. I was so good at coloring in the lines. I would never color outside the line. I would always color the right color, and I was very good at coloring. And I was very proud of how good I was at coloring. And I looked down at my other fellow students who were not as good at coloring. And I was so good at coloring that I felt very good and morally superior about myself, like all of you do who are here, who didn't get scared off by the weather, compared to those who didn't make it today. That might have been a little bit of a jump. But the point being, I was so good at staying in the line, so good at obeying the rules, that I started to overlook other, more important rules, like being nice to my fellow students, like not being really stuck up and proud of myself, like not thinking I was the coolest thing on planet Earth because I was so good at coloring within the lines. Some of us, maybe our problem isn't with building altars, but maybe our challenge is with being so good at obeying rules, so good at coloring in the lines, so good at following God's commands, so good at being the good Christian, so good at having the right life, that we actually forget who commanded the commands we're obeying. We can get so good at obeying commands, we forget that obedience was never just about obeying a rule. It was about obeying a person, obeying our God. Could it be in our zeal to keep laws and keep rules and keep commands that we've forgotten to sometimes simply just be nice to others? Could it be we're so good at keeping rules and commands and giving the right amount of money and doing the right amount of things and volunteering at the right amount of stuff that we forget to just spend time with our Creator? Could it be that sometimes we get so focused on coloring in the lines that we forget who it is that made the lines in the first place? That's the value the Eastern tribes add to this conversation. They were coloring a little outside the lines. It's kind of weird to build an altar that you don't sacrifice on. It's like having a dining room table that you never eat on, which most of you probably have. But it's kind of bizarre to do. But it's not against God's command. The command was don't sacrifice on an altar, not don't build an altar. They weren't disobeying God. In fact, coloring outside the lines a bit actually strengthened their relationship with God. The question for us might be, have we become so good at obeying rules that we've forgotten who we're obeying? Could it be possible that others who maybe aren't living lives that we think are the best kinds of lives, that maybe they don't volunteer enough or do enough or are in church enough or do this or that maybe we actually have something to learn from them too? Because what happens when these two sides encounter one another, when the seriousness of following God's commands encounters the purposeful obedience of God's commands, they end up having an encounter with God himself. We're told that the high priest Phineas says, "Today, now we know the Lord is with us. He's in our midst, because you've not been unfaithful to the Lord in this matter." He said, now we know. We were worried, but now we know after this conversation, after this meeting, that God is in our midst. Your obedience and our seriousness have helped us see more of who God is. That's a good lesson for us today. It's helpful because it reminds us that it's important to invite others into our walk. It's important that it reminds us to have others come into our walk and for us to invite ourselves into others' Christian walks. But isn't it still a little bit far from us today? Because we don't have an altar. We don't have a tabernacle. Or do we? Because we're told in Hebrews that we do actually have an altar, from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. What is this altar? Well, it's Jesus Christ himself, who suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy by his blood. So let us therefore come to him. The imagery is kind of funny. We're told Jesus, on the one hand, is the sacrifice on the altar. He's a sacrifice for God so that you and I no longer have to sacrifice to have right standing with God. Our sins have been forgiven, our relationship with God has been made new, and because of that, we can begin to walk with him in right standing. Because of Jesus' sacrifice, we no longer have to sacrifice. But at the same time, the writer of Hebrews tells us Jesus is also now the altar. If Jesus is the altar, then what's the sacrifice we place on it? Well, we're told the sacrifice we bring is ourselves. Let us go to him. Though Jesus has sacrificed so that our standing with God is made right, he also now is the altar on which we give him our whole lives. Is there a false altar we have built up? And how can we tear that down, replace it with Christ himself, and give ourselves on that altar? Secondly, we're told that we do in fact have a tabernacle. Better, we have a temple. We're told the Holy Spirit himself. Do we not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, which you've received from God? If this is the case, it means that no longer do we have to go to a special place, no longer do we have to go across the Jordan, no longer do we have to go somewhere to access community with God, but we have God's Spirit himself residing within us at all times. And if we want to experience God, we want to know God, we want to dwell with God, we want to come closer to God, then the key is to become more aware of that Spirit. That Holy Spirit himself is the one who enables us to sacrifice our lives on that altar of Jesus Christ. That's not something we can do of our own power. But through the Spirit living in us, we're more enabled to live the lives we're called to live. So what then might that look like in the weeks for us to come? Firstly, to take God seriously. Is there an altar? One of sin, one of a good thing that maybe got in the wrong priority, but is there some altar that comes to mind that's taken the place in your life of God, who Jesus Christ calls us to sacrifice our whole lives to out of gratitude for Christ's sacrifice for us? What might it look like to take down that altar? What might it look like to invite other people to hold you accountable, to ask you questions, to walk with you in that process, like the Western tribes confronted the Eastern tribes? Secondly, what might it look like to obey God purposefully? Are you as good at coloring in the lines as 6-year-old Pastor Steve? And is that maybe coloring some of the other lines that we're forgetting to obey? Have we been so good at obeying rules we've forgotten to be loving? We've forgotten to spend time with our God. We've forgotten the one who commanded the rules in the first place. What might it look like to invite people to ask, hey, I think I'm walking with God, but is there anything in me you see that could be improved, that could be challenged, that could be changed? And finally, if we do these things, let us seek to more cultivate our experience of God's presence through the Holy Spirit who lives within us through Jesus Christ who sacrificed himself for us. What might our lives look like if once a week we had somebody ask us, what is your relationship with God like this week? What might our lives look like if once a week we ask somebody else, what is your relationship with God like this week? What if we invited others in and we invited ourselves in? Because as we see from this story, when we come alongside one another, it helps us take God seriously, obey him purposefully, so that we may indeed experience more of his presence. Amen. In response to that offer of grace from God, let's respond with our own offering. I'll see ushers to please come forward to receive the tithes and the offerings.